The research base on Tellurian 4 was a marvel of human ingenuity. Perched on the edge of the galaxy's most volatile nebula, it had been built to study the enigmatic properties of the Crimson Vale, a shimmering energy field that defied the laws of physics. Dr. Eric Vale, lead xenobiologist, stood on the observation deck, staring at the Vale's hypnotic glow. Despite the beauty of his surroundings, Eric felt uneasy. Something was wrong. "Eric!" A voice crackled through his comlink. It was Lieutenant Torin, head of security. "We've picked up unidentified movement just outside the perimeter. I suggest you cut your observation time short." Eric sighed. He'd heard rumors of Vector Raiders, a brutal alien race known for their unprovoked attacks on frontier stations like Tellurian 4. The Vector were merciless predators, their reptilian faces often depicted in human propaganda vids with sharp, needle-like teeth and glowing crimson eyes. "I'll head back," Eric replied reluctantly. As he turned to leave, the ground trembled. The lights flickered and alarms blared. "Raiders!" Torin shouted over the comlink, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of explosions. The Vector had arrived. Eric sprinted through the corridors, his heart pounding as the station shook violently. Around him, the facility erupted into chaos. Scientists scattering, security personnel barking orders, and the mechanical whir of defense drones spinning up to intercept the invaders. He barely made it into the laboratory when the walls behind him burst inward, throwing him to the ground. A hulking Vector warrior stepped through the smoke, its elongated claws glinting in the flickering light. Eric scrambled backward, but there was no escape. Suddenly, a blur of motion darted between him and the alien. A figure clad in sleek, obsidian armor raised a blade that shimmered with alien energy. The Vector roared in challenge, but its opponent moved with an almost otherworldly grace, dodging its strikes and countering with lethal precision. Eric realized the figure wasn't human. The armor's design and the iridescent markings on her exposed skin identified her as a Selethran, a race as feared as the Vector. But unlike the brutish raiders, the Selethran were known for their cold, calculating intelligence and their reputation as solitary hunters. What was one of them doing here? The fight ended as quickly as it began. The Selethran warrior drove her blade into the Vector's chest, and the raider collapsed with a guttural snarl. She turned to Eric, her silver eyes locking onto his. "Are you injured?" she asked, her voice soft but commanding. Eric blinked. He'd never heard of a Selethran speaking galactic common. No, I'm fine. We need to leave." "More are coming," she said, offering him her hand. Hesitant, he took it, her grip firm and steady despite her slender build. "Who are you?" he managed as she led him through the maze of corridors. "My name is Sireen," she replied, "and if you want to live, you'll follow my lead." Eric and Sireen emerged into the nightmarish landscape outside the base. The Crimson Vale loomed above them, casting an eerie red light that painted the jagged cliffs and dense forests in blood hues. In the distance, the sounds of battle raged, explosions, screams, and the unmistakable hum of plasma weapons. "We need to reach the ridge," Sireen said, pointing to a rocky outcrop overlooking the Vale. "From there, I can signal my ship." "Your ship?" Eric asked, struggling to keep up with her swift pace. "What are you even doing here?" The Selethran aren't exactly known for charity. Sireen glanced at him, her silver eyes narrowing. "Not all of us fit your stereotypes, human. I was tracking the Vector when I intercepted their plans to attack your base. I couldn't stand by and let them slaughter innocents." Her words unsettled Eric. He'd spent his career studying alien species, but the Selethran were an enigma. They were always portrayed as calculating and self-serving, yet here was one risking her life for strangers. Before he could respond, a guttural roar echoed from behind. A group of Vector raiders burst from the tree line, their glowing eyes locked onto the fleeing pair. "Get down!" Sireen shouted, pushing Eric behind a boulder. She drew her weapon, a sleek, double-edged blade that pulsed with blue energy, and charged the raiders. Eric watched in awe as she fought. Sireen moved like a shadow, her strikes precise and deadly. But the Vector outnumbered her, and Eric knew she couldn't hold them off forever. Gritting his teeth, He grabbed a fallen plasma rifle and fired, the recoil nearly knocking him over. His shot hit one of the raiders, and it collapsed with a screech. Sireen spared him a brief glance. Not bad for a scientist. They reached the ridge just as Sireen's ship, a sleek, black vessel with angular wings, descended through the thick clouds. The boarding ramp extended, and Sireen pushed Eric inside before following. As the ship ascended, Eric slumped against the wall, exhausted. Sireen stood at the controls, her hands flying over the holographic interface. "You saved me," Eric said after a moment. "Thank you." Sireen turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Don't thank me yet. The Vector won't give up so easily." Eric studied her, noting the faint scars on her face and the wear on her armor. She was a warrior, but there was a kindness in her eyes that contradicted the fearsome reputation of her people. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "And what did you expect?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. "Someone ruthless, calculating, not someone willing to risk their life for a stranger." Sireen smirked. "Perhaps you humans don't know us as well as you think." The ship shuddered as something struck its hull. Alarms blared, and Sireen's smirk vanished. "They found us," she said grimly. "Hold on, Dr. Vale. This fight isn't over." As Sireen piloted the ship through the chaotic skies, Eric couldn't help but feel a growing respect for her. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a survivor. Someone who had chosen to defy the expectations of her people and fight for something greater. But the Vector weren't the only threat. The Crimson Vale loomed ahead, its swirling energy a constant reminder of the unknown. And as their ship dove into the Vale's crimson light, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was just beginning. The ship groaned as it plunged into the Crimson Vale. Outside the viewport, the swirling energy of the Vale coalesced into a dizzying array of colors, shapes, and flashes of light that defied logic. Eric gripped the edge of his seat as the vessel bucked violently. "What's happening?" he shouted over the roar of the engines. Sireen's hands flew over the controls, her jaw set in determination. "The Vale doesn't obey the rules of normal space. It's distorting the ship's systems and—" She was interrupted as the ship lurched sideways, throwing sparks from an overhead console. Eric's pulse raced as a faint, otherworldly hum filled the cabin. It was faint at first but grew louder, resonating deep in his chest. He exchanged a nervous glance with Sireen. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Sireen nodded, her eyes narrowing. "It's the Vale. It's not just an energy field, it's alive." Eric's scientific instincts flared, even amid the chaos. "Alive? You mean sentient?" "Possibly. But if we don't get through it, we'll never know." Sireen's fingers danced across the interface, bypassing failing systems and rerouting power to the engines. The hum deepened, and for a brief moment, the swirling light outside the viewport coalesced into a single image, a vast, glowing eye. Eric's breath caught in his throat. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Sireen hesitated, her hands hovering over the controls. "I saw it," she admitted, "and I don't think it was a coincidence." The ship burst out of the Vale like a bullet, tumbling into the relative calm of open space. Eric and Sireen barely had time to catch their breath before the comms crackled to life. "This is Commander Tharn of the Vector Raider Fleet. Surrender your vessel, and you will be spared." Sireen's face darkened as she glared at the comms panel. Spared? Their idea of sparing is a slow death. Eric's stomach twisted as the ship's sensors lit up, displaying a massive Vector dreadnought flanked by smaller attack craft. "We can't fight that," he said. Sireen's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, but we can outsmart them." Eric watched as she adjusted their course, aiming directly at a nearby asteroid field. The Vector ships followed, their weapons lighting up the void as they fired plasma bolts that barely missed the fleeing vessel. The ship dove into the asteroid field, weaving between massive, tumbling rocks. Sireen's piloting was impeccable, but the Vector were relentless. A plasma bolt struck the ship's rear engines, and the vessel shuddered violently. "We're losing power," Eric shouted. Sireen gritted her teeth. "Hold on to something." She veered sharply, skimming the surface of a massive asteroid. The maneuver sent chunks of debris flying into the path of their pursuers. One Vector fighter collided with a fragment, exploding in a fiery burst. "That won't stop them for long," Eric said, his voice tight with panic. "No," Sireen agreed, "but it bought us time." The ship limped into the shadow of a colossal asteroid, its damaged engines sputtering. Eric stared at the flickering controls, trying to push aside the growing sense of doom. "What's the plan now?" he asked. Sireen's gaze was distant, her silver eyes unfocused. "The Vale," she said quietly. "It called to us. I felt it. Didn't you?" Eric hesitated, recalling the image of the glowing eye. I don't know what I felt." Sireen turned to him, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I think it wants something from us. And I think it's the only way we're getting out of this alive." Eric frowned. "You're saying we should go back into the Vale? That's suicide." "Maybe," Sireen admitted. "But if it's alive, if it's sentient, then it might also be listening." Eric swallowed hard, torn between his fear and his curiosity. The Crimson Vale was the most mysterious phenomenon in the galaxy, an anomaly no one had ever returned from. But Sireen's certainty was undeniable. Before he could argue further, the Vector dreadnought appeared on their sensors, its weapons charging. "Looks like we don't have a choice," Sireen said grimly. With a deep breath, she pushed the ship's engines to their limit, propelling them back toward the shimmering red haze of the Vale. The moment they re-entered the Vale, the hum returned, louder and more resonant. Eric clutched his head as the vibrations seemed to pierce his skull. But amid the chaos, a voice, soft and melodic, emerged. "Why have you returned?" it asked, echoing in their minds. Eric looked at Sireen, who seemed equally stunned. "Did you hear that?" he asked. She nodded. "It's the Vale." Eric hesitated, then spoke aloud. We didn't have a choice. The Vector are trying to kill us." "The Vector are unworthy," the voice replied. "But what makes you worthy, human?" Eric faltered, unsure how to respond. I don't know. I'm just a scientist. I study life. I want to understand the universe." The Vale's voice shifted, growing softer. "And you, Selethrin?" Sireen straightened, her tone firm. "I fight to protect, not just myself, but others, even those who fear me." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the voice spoke again. "You have earned my attention, but to leave, you must prove your worth." The swirling light outside the viewport began to shift, forming strange, labyrinthine patterns. Eric and Sireen exchanged a tense glance as the ship was pulled deeper into the Vale's depths. "Prove our worth," Eric muttered. "What does that mean?" Sireen gripped the controls, her silver eyes blazing. "It means we're about to find out." The ship drifted through the Crimson Vale's endless expanse, the swirling energy around them now forming intricate patterns that glowed with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Eric couldn't tell if the patterns were naturally occurring or deliberate, but he felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The voice returned, deeper and more resonant this time. "Your trial begins. Prove your purpose, or be consumed." Before Eric could ask what that meant, the ship's controls seized up. Warning lights flared, and the vessel came to an abrupt halt. Sireen slammed her hands against the console. "We've lost all power," she said, her frustration bleeding into her voice. "The Vale is controlling everything." Eric stared out the viewport, his unease growing as the patterns began to twist and change. Shapes started to form, vague at first, then more distinct. Human figures, alien forms, creatures Eric couldn't identify. They appeared as phantoms, made of pure light, their features contorted in anguish. "What are they?" Eric whispered, his breath fogging the viewport. Sireen leaned closer, her hand instinctively moving to the hilt of her blade. "They look like echoes, memories." The figures floated closer, their mouths opening in silent cries. Eric felt a jolt of recognition. Among them, he saw the face of his former colleague, Dr. Helen Riker, who had vanished during an expedition into the Vale years ago. Her eyes, wide and pleading, seemed to lock onto his. "Helen," Eric muttered, his voice trembling. Sireen grabbed his arm. "Stay focused. They're not real. But they're so. They're a distraction. She cut him off. The veil is testing you. Eric tore his gaze away from the figures, his mind racing. If this was a trial, it wasn't just physical, it was psychological. And the veil knew exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. The voice returned, colder now. Your fears bind you. Face them, or fail. Suddenly, the ship's interior dissolved around them, replaced by a barren, desolate landscape. The ground was cracked and lifeless, the sky an oppressive red. Eric and Sireen stood side by side, their breath visible in the chilled air. Eric turned to Sireen. Is this real? Does it matter? She replied, unsheathing her blade. We survive, no matter what. A deafening roar echoed across the wasteland. In the distance, a massive shadow emerged, its form shifting and unstable. It was monstrous, its size dwarfing anything Eric had ever seen. As it drew closer, its features became clearer, a grotesque amalgamation of vector warriors and human faces, including Helen's. What is that? Eric gasped, stumbling back. Sireen stepped forward, her blade at the ready. It's fear, she said grimly. Your fear. The creature lunged, its many faces contorting into screams. Sireen dodged the attack with practiced precision, slashing at the beast's clawed limbs. Her blade cut through its flesh, but the wounds sealed instantly, the creature reforming as if mocking her efforts. Eric stood frozen, his mind racing. This wasn't a physical enemy. It was a manifestation of their inner struggles. Fighting it with brute force was pointless. It's not real, Eric shouted, trying to convince himself as much as Sireen. It's a projection. Sireen spared him a glance, dodging another attack. Then how do we stop it? Eric's mind flashed back to the Vale's words, your fears bind you. He realized the key wasn't to fight the creature, but to confront the emotions fueling it. Stand down, he yelled at Sireen. What? She snapped, barely avoiding the creature's lashing tail. I think I know what to do. Eric ran forward, planting himself between the creature and Sireen. He raised his hands, his voice trembling. I'm not afraid of you. The creature paused, its many faces shifting to focus on Eric. He forced himself to hold its gaze, despite the terror clawing at his mind. You're not real, he said firmly. You're a reflection of my fear, and I won't let you control me. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the creature began to dissolve, its massive form breaking apart like sand blown by the wind. Eric turned to Sireen, relief flooding his chest. It worked, he said, his voice shaking. Sireen gave him an approving nod. Not bad, human. The wasteland faded, and they found themselves back on the ship. The controls flickered to life, and the Vale's voice returned. One fear conquered, another remains. Sireen stiffened, her grip tightening on her blade. What does it mean? Before Eric could respond, the ship's interior warped again. But this time the vision was different. They stood in a grand hall, its walls adorned with intricate carvings depicting battles and victories. Sireen's face went pale. This is, she began, but her voice trailed off. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing. It was a Selethran warrior clad in ceremonial armor, his silver eyes burning with disdain. He looked at Sireen with a mixture of disappointment and anger. Sireen, the figure said, his voice cold. You disgrace your bloodline. Sireen's knuckles whitened around her blade. You're not real. You're dead. The figure stepped closer. I am more real than you admit. You fled your people, abandoned our ways. For what? To protect creatures that see you as a monster? Eric watched the exchange, understanding dawning. Sireen's fear wasn't physical. It was tied to her past, her people, and the expectations she had defied. Is this true? Eric asked softly. Sireen's gaze didn't waver from the figure. I left because I didn't believe in what we stood for anymore. Endless conquest. Endless war. I wanted more than that. The figure sneered. You've made yourself weak. No, Sireen said, her voice steady. I made myself free. The figure lunged at her, but Sireen didn't flinch.